So, without further ado, sabbaticals are really cool. I encourage everybody to take them when they're eligible for them. This is my third sabbatical, and I'm a big fan of staying put at home and doing things that you always want to do while you're working. I know a lot of people are into traveling. Traveling is great. This is basically, along with a number of other things, I did 30 drawings in 30-ish days, or how I squandered another sabbatical and discovered the common ancestry of pumpkins, octopi, and umbrellas. I'm going to show about 60 slides in 20 minutes or 15 minutes. So we'll see how this goes. And if I can advance. There we go. So I'm going to walk through a bunch of art that I did over sabbatical and sort of how it came to be and what I was thinking about. And spoiler, it's all Dynamo. Other stuff, along with drawings, I did some other things over sabbatical. I read a bunch of books. I did a bunch of writing. I picked a bunch of grapes. I made a bunch of wine. Did some pottery. Got the pottery wheel going back up again, which if anybody wants to take a whack at doing some pottery, let me know. Come on over. We'll throw some pots. Had some nice output like this out in my shed. And I also managed to go to the Built conference in Scotland, took a little break from my break to go back to work, where we asked the big questions about architecture. There was a hackathon that was also part of that, which was fun. And got to see a little bit of Scotland and do some biking and see some sheep and get back in time to carve some pumpkins for Halloween. But the main thrust of it was that I was interested in doing some tools and using some tools and doing some drawings. And there's a lot of precedents that I've always looked to for kind of inspiration in doing art. A couple of them here. This is Jasper Johns. He was a 1950s and 60s abstract expressionist. And one of the things that he was really into is he kept using the same sort of iconic imagery, targets and flags and other sort of common day icons. And his whole gig was, how do you start using recognizable icons as something that you can express with different kinds of line and figuration? Jim Dine was another one who did similar stuff with hearts and sort of mundane, banal stuff, and was really just looking at what is the difference between different mark-making techniques that say different things about these sort of recognizable icons. More importantly, and sort of more closer to my heart, is Vera Molnar, who's she was born in like the 20s in Hungary, and basically started doing computational art in the 70s. Was one of the first people to really look at how to start using computers and printing technology and machines as an automated way of exploring algorithms. And then the last precedent was my own computational pumpkin competition that I did for about 5 years back in 2014, where customers were basically signing up and sending in pumpkins to evaluate and look at in the Halloween season. I stopped doing that after about 6 years when things really started getting crazy and I felt a little overwhelmed by it. People were doing very big projects that were very exciting. Somebody made a video game that shot pumpkins out of the front of it. That's the big laser up in the upper right. People doing banana stuff with digital Lego. So anyway, that pumpkins have become a big part of a vocabulary that I've been using for years, of sort of a repeated way of making art and making form. There's a very specific set of tools that I used. I had a very little modest corner of my house that I set up to do drawings and to do work in. And everything that I'm about to show was done basically in two programs. One that you might know of called Dynamo, an open source application for doing algorithmic design, and Inkscape, which is an open source tool for vector processing, and it's basically Illustrator in the open source land. I got a robot printer. This is the AxiDraw. I was cheap and I got a Chinese knockoff because I figured I was going to actually abuse this machine and probably break it during the course of a month, which I've gotten close to, but I haven't quite broken it yet. If I was a better person, I would have bought the AxiDraw. And a hell of a lot of pens. So the process and the products that engaged in over this course of the month was basically just started off by doing some scales of trying to sort of reproduce some of the work. So this is me making my own knockoff of a Vera Molnar. And just starting to try and understand how this thing works. Putting down, up, down, and back and forth, and depending on the program, do those sorts of things you do interest geometry or so these were sort of my first outings of trying to get this thing to go. And getting into initial drawing sets of saying, how can we start playing around with the pumpkin as a form? How can we start playing around with repeated patterns with like the Vera Molnar kind of patterning? And just sort of starting to sort of stretch my fingers around how to use this combination of hardware and software. A lot of the challenges that came up in doing this kind of work was how do you go from some relatively sterile looking formal explorations with the pumpkin on the left and get into something that's much more gestural and into sort of a handmade or unique feel with the thing on the right. A lot of that came down to one part of the process being how do you actually make the form that you're going to study, which is the basic sort of lofting techniques and sort of mathematical geometric operations to start getting the basic form. But then when it started to get more interesting was how do you start taking those sorts of forms and breaking them down into surfaces and lines and flat curves that you can actually use in a robot printer. So basically I started making my own ray casting tools and my own one-point perspective tools that started taking those sorts of geometry and pushing them down onto flat surfaces, where you can start getting these sort of analytic models that come out of very literal geometric models. And then from that going out into Inkscape and getting them ready for the robot printer to start doing first some fairly sort of sterile pen drawings. This isn't much different than what you would do with the old pen drawers back in the 70s when they first started making these sorts of tools available. But then it starts to get a little bit more interesting when you start getting goofier stuff attached to the robot, and then you can start getting into more gestural stuff, more sort of expressive line work. And that starts to look like these sorts of drawings where you don't exactly know what's going to come out when you start sending these things to the machine to print. Unlike when you start printing things to a regular inkjet printer, this is where you're really starting to look for non-repeatable aspects or accidents start happening. At the same time, and now for something slightly different, I was reading a bunch of books on octopuses, as it turns out. Children of Ruin, which if nobody's read it, is an awesome science fiction book by Adrian Tchaikovsky about space octopuses and space spiders, and it's much better than that sounds. And Peter Godfrey Smith, who does a lot of writing about different kinds of ways of consciousness and different kinds of intelligence, and gets into the octopus is a super smart and very differently smart creature than we know of, and I don't recommend eating octopus anymore. This became a little bit of a distraction, and I started doing a lot more sketching around octopuses, and then started to bleed that back into the same work that was happening on the dynamo and robot drawing techniques, looking at tentacles and looking at pattern making and looking at line making, and eventually getting into some more figuration around octopuses and multi-armed things. This is using things like shortest path algorithms in order to find how these arms get generated. And then once you make one octopus, you might as well make a whole bunch of octopuses and do them parametrically. And I started looking at this feature of the octopus's head and realizing that this little particular piece of it, which is down here in the dynamo graph, could really become something that would inform the pumpkins, because my pumpkins up till now had been kind of static. And so I took that same piece of algorithm from the octopus and started using it to draw the pumpkin stem. And then I scratched my head and said, well, if I can take the octopus and use it to drive a pumpkin, can I use the pumpkin to go back and drive the octopus? And so I found that there is a common algorithmic ancestor between octopuses and pumpkins, which then, of course, leads to a whole other set of explorations where let's go for it, let's do lots of octopuses, see how far this goes. And because it's parametric, you can make them move, you can make them explore their own space, you can understand more about their octopusness. And as I started sketching these things and getting more obsessive about octopuses and pumpkins, I also started discovering, wait a second, umbrellas share a certain aspect that octopuses and pumpkins have. Same sort of array, same sort of stem, sort of harmonization of collections with singular aspects that join them together, and got onto the idea that, in fact, I had discovered that umbrellas, octopuses, and pumpkins share a common ancestor. So can we test that out? Can we make an umbrella out of the same algorithmic backing that comes from octopuses and pumpkins? The answer is yes, you can. So if you were wondering about this, you can now tell your families, indeed, this is possible. So once that happens and you've established the basic trinity of octopuses, pumpkins, and umbrellas, Bob's your uncle, and you can start exploring out all sorts of ideas that are associated with that. So going back to some of those hairy drawings that happen with the octopus tentacles over here on the left, looking at the Vera Molnar and turning that into something more like rain, and then using the rain that was used previously and making that into water for octopuses. Really starting to get into the sort of the vigorous line making and gesture that's available when you actually go from on-screen production into paper and pencil. Actually starting to spend a lot more time doing things like ink washes and many, many layers. These are like 6 or 7 layers of different passes of the machine. Starting to get into the differences between pencil and pen usage to get a little bit more depth into that rain, starting to get something that's sort of like foreground and background. And of course, because it's all parametric, you can open and close things, and you can try things very coldly with single line drawings, as well as using things like erasers and other kind of tooling to start doing subtractive drawing as well. Starting to get a little goofy off towards the end with sort of getting into the mechanisms behind umbrellas. And then things kind of went off the rails. Robot arm in a way that it's not designed to do, but can, turns out, also start making etching with a pen plotter, which I didn't get a chance to actually use the printing process, but did manage to get to the point where you can start just making plates that have their own drawings on them, which gives a whole other sort of level of physicality, because this is an actual engraved plate with ink squished into it. And then finally, it starts to get destructive when you start putting your phone into the process and carving up your phone with your abused robot arm using a Dremel tool. My phone barely survived. At any rate, at the end of this, I now have a sort of an art setup down in my house, which I can start using on a regular basis to do things like birthday cards for my niece and other family members. Always thought that we could always use our tools a little bit more within our daily lives to enrich our own lives and our families. And that's it. And I encourage everybody to explore their homes in sabbatical as much as the rest of the world. Any questions?
When is your Build Space exhibition going to go up?
I could do that. Oh.
I think that would be really cool. Like, there's a lot of really interesting ideas around in this that I think a lot of people down there would appreciate.
Yeah, I actually was thinking at the outset of the sabbatical that I was going to be coming in sort of with a fake mustache and glasses on and using the laser cutter and other machines here. But it turns out that, you know, a lot of the kinds of ideas that I wanted to explore were available for cheap at home. Because a lot of the stuff I'd had up until now relied on the build space in order to be able to do.
There was a slide there where it showed you the robot going over to the watercolor palette and adding paint to the brush. How much of that was automated with the pens and stuff versus you know, manual kind of stop, pause, put another pen in the arm or whatever?
So this is entirely automated. So basically, the dynamo drawing goes through, and you have the basic drawing, which is up here, which is in Dynamo is just a series of lines.
Mhm.
And then you can inject into that drawing, I'm going to draw this set of lines, and then I'm going to draw a circle over here. And then I'm going to draw a line here, and then I'm going to draw a circle over here. And then back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So all the intelligence lives in the Dynamo drawing, which basically injects sort of a cleaning step and in a reload step before going back out to do the drawing step.
So how about say the slide right above that where with the squares? Looks like they're different pin tips maybe, or did you just go over multiple times?
Yeah, so this is all the same pen.
Okay.
And the routine is basically for every cell, there's a random distribution of slightly tilted and differently scaled rectangles. And then, so this heavy line is basically the accumulation of 2 or 3 lines close to each other. And the thin line is just sort of a standalone one that didn't happen to be near another one. Everything about interacting with these pens and these drawings ended up being sort of surprising things that happen on paper that are hard to anticipate when it's all perfectly done on your screen in digital.
Did you read stuff about how Werner Molnar did this, or is it from just looking?
Most of it's just from looking at this stuff and trying to sort of this is entirely reverse engineered. So the drawing is back in here. This is sort of a classic Werner Molnar drawing, which has that there's probably a lot of different ways that you could reproduce this kind of effect. I think that she had some things where it wasn't maintaining a strict squareness of the element that it was doing. Like there was some additional parameters around rhomboidness as well as scale and rotation. But I'd love to be able to read more about it and figure out if there was a cache of her old algorithms and see what would happen if you tried to reproduce them.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
There's another artist from around the same time called Manfred Mohr, who was also really interested in looking at sort of this pattern and variation. And he's done a little bit more writing on sort of his process, and it was very much based around language and how you can take language and break it down into sort of component parts. And then once you get 5 or 6 different component parts, you can have sort of infinite variation of recombining them. There's some interesting stuff around that too that I've also tried to sort of reverse engineer.
So the very first time that you bolted your Dremel tool to the AxiDraw and then hit the on switch, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for that moment. But
you mean the covering your eyes and pushing the button?
Yeah. Yeah, was there a Mythbusters blast shield involved, or did you just sort of go for it?
Yeah, were you wearing safety goggles?
The first couple of rounds were actually where this tool is hooked up to a handheld drill. So I was squeezing the drill and then pressing go on the machine, and so I could take my finger off the drill if anything goes wrong.
Gotcha. Okay. So
but the biggest issue is that the pen plotter started making a whole other sort of collection of strange noises after being loaded up this way. The whole rig for this it looks like an IV drip where there's a big pole mounted on the side of the table that holds the Dremel, and then there's a giant flexible hose that goes down to this guy.
Gotcha. Okay. I thought this was a plug it in and just press the go button and run away situation, but that sounds a lot safer.
there was a little bit of caution.
This is super awesome. Thanks for showing us this.
Thanks. Mike, you had a question?